Hello students, this is your next flipped grammar lesson. This week we will be learning about complex sentences. For this lesson you will need your Whisk worksheet and a pen or a pencil. If you lost your copy of the Whisk worksheet, you can find another copy on Edmodo or my website. At the top of the worksheet, under the unit of study, please write complex sentences. Then, in the W section, write where and when you watched this video. Let's get ready to get started. We'll start with a quick review. All of the information on this slide is information you have learned already this year. You shouldn't need to include it on your Whisk worksheet during the summary unless it's something that you're still having trouble with. Let's look at the first thing we need to review, which is subjects and predicates. Please remember that the subject of a sentence is a noun, and it tells who or what the sentence is about. The predicate of a sentence contains the verb. It tells the action or condition of the subject. Later on in this video, we will need to make sure we have a subject and predicate in the types of clauses we will be learning about. The other thing we need to remember from the past is simple sentences. A simple sentence contains a subject, verb, and a complete idea. Simple sentences can be combined to make compound sentences. I hope you remember our helpful mnemonic device, Fanboys, that helps us remember the most common coordinating conjunctions. Coordinating conjunctions are used to combine simple sentences into compound sentences. Once again, all of the information on this slide should be review. So hopefully you've got it down and are ready for the new information coming up next. The first new topic we'll be learning about this week is independent clauses. When you see the word independent, you might think of something that's kind of grown up and doesn't need to rely on anything else for the things that it needs. Well, independent clauses kind of act this way in grammar. Independent clauses contain a subject and a predicate. Also, independent clauses have a complete thought. Simple sentences are a kind of independent clause. Also, independent clauses can stand on their own as a complete sentence. So, by adding the proper capitalization and punctuation, you can make a real, simple sentence out of an independent clause. On the other hand, you have dependent clauses. There are some similarities between independent and dependent clauses, but dependent clauses have some important differences. First, like an independent clause, a dependent clause contains a subject and a predicate. However, a dependent clause does not contain a complete thought. Instead, a dependent clause depends on an independent clause to have a complete meaning. So you can think about a dependent clause kind of like a little kid. It depends on its parents, or its independent clause, in order to make a complete sentence. Dependent clauses begin with something called a subordinating conjunction, or a relative pronoun. We won't be talking too much about relative pronouns this week. Some examples are that, who, and which. However, we will be dealing with subordinating conjunctions. Please don't confuse subordinating conjunctions with coordinating conjunctions. Remember, the coordinating conjunctions can be remembered with the mnemonic Fanboys, and we use those to combine two simple sentences into a compound sentence. Subordinating conjunctions, on the other hand, are found at the beginning of some dependent clauses. So, if you see a subordinating conjunction at the beginning of a clause, you know it's a dependent clause, and therefore it cannot stand on its own as a complete sentence. So, you will need to add an independent clause to it in order to avoid a sentence fragment. On this slide, you can see some common subordinating conjunctions that you might find in your writing. Please notice because, when, and if are written extra large. Those are very common subordinating conjunctions that we will deal with in this unit and during this year. Now that you've seen the difference between an independent clause and a dependent clause, we're going to practice putting them together. When you put one or more independent clause together with one or more dependent clause, you make a complex sentence. You put these together by adding a subordinating conjunction to the beginning of the clause that you want to make dependent on the other one. Let's watch the video and practice putting together these two simple sentences, which are also independent clauses. You will need to figure out which independent clause should get a subordinating conjunction tacked on to the front of it in order to make it dependent. Right now, your independent clauses are: he ripped up the paper airplane, it couldn't fly very far. Just saw, we combined the two independent clauses in order to make a complex sentence. We did this by putting a subordinating conjunction at the beginning of the second clause. Then, when we put the two sentences together, we had a complex sentence. The sentence altogether became, he ripped up the paper airplane because it couldn't fly very far. Because is a subordinating conjunction. For another example, watch the next video and see how the following two independent clauses were put together into a complex sentence. I'm going to do this by adding a subordinating conjunction to the beginning of one of the independent clauses in order to make it a dependent clause. The two independent clauses right now are: the model airplane hit the ceiling, it was able to recover and perform some tricks. We made a complex sentence by adding a subordinating conjunction to the beginning of the first clause. By adding that subordinating conjunction, we turned it from an independent clause that could stand on its own into a dependent clause that needed to be attached to an independent clause in order to make a complete sentence. Our new complex sentence, therefore, was: although the model airplane hit the ceiling, it was able to recover and perform some tricks. There is one very important thing that I still need to share with you about dependent and independent clauses when you're making complex sentences. When you put dependent and independent clauses together to make a complex sentence, you need to make sure that you are following the correct comma rules. In the examples from the videos that we showed, you might have noticed that I put a comma in one of the sentences but not in the other. Let's take a look at the rule to figure out why. First, if your sentence begins with a dependent clause and ends with an independent clause, you will use a comma between the dependent and independent clauses. For example, before the game was over, Ed scored one more goal. Notice that the subordinating conjunction before is at the beginning of the sentence. Therefore, before the game was over is a dependent clause that starts the sentence. We put a comma after that clause is over with to show the separation between the dependent and the independent clause. However, there is a difference if you start the sentence with the independent clause and end with the dependent clause. A comma is not needed when the dependent clause comes at the end of the sentence. Let's look at the example. Ray forgot the water, although he was reminded 5 times. We have the subordinating conjunction although, which shows us that although he was reminded 5 times is a dependent clause. Since that clause comes at the end of the sentence, we will not use a comma between the independent and dependent clauses. We've come to the end of our grammar video for this week. The topic of complex sentences and subordinating conjunctions can be pretty tricky for a lot of students, so please feel free to watch this video again if you need another chance to try to absorb the information. Once you're comfortable, please fill out the S and Q sections of your WISC worksheet. In the S section, please write a 5-sentence summary of what you learned from the video. In the Q section, write a question that you might still have about what you were learning in the video. If you don't have any questions, you will create a test question for your classmates. Be sure to complete your assignment on time and turn it in by the due date. We'll see you next time.